The room at Medmenham is perpetually cold. It is a draughty corner of a mock Tudor mansion where the scent of damp stone and stale tea hangs heavy in the dim light of late 1943. Constance Babington Smith sits hunched over a stereoscope. Her neck aches from hours of motionless scrutiny. Through the twin lenses, the grainy grey landscape of Peenemünde snaps into a ghostly three-dimensional relief. She is searching for a shadow, a shape, a ghost in the machine of the Nazi war effort. Her eyes are strained by what the pilots call the Aleutian stare as they scan a small airfield near the Baltic shore. There, amidst the blur of industrial hangars and sandy tracks, she sees it. A tiny, cruciform speck, no larger than a grain of salt. It is a miniature airplane with no cockpit, sitting on a launch ramp like a lethal toy. The silence in the room feels heavy and suffocating. If she is right, this is the missing link. This is the robotic flying bomb that will soon rain fire on London. If she is wrong, she will be sending hundreds of Allied bombers into a flak-choked hell for a phantom. She does not blink. She simply reaches for her magnifying glass, the cold metal biting into her thumb. In this moment, the unblinking eye of the camera finally meets the intuitive spark of the human mind. But to understand how one woman's intuition became the shield of a nation, we have to look back to a time of catastrophic neglect. This moment of surgical precision was a miracle born of a disaster. 25 years earlier, in the mud of 1918, the British military had realized that a single photograph could blunt a German offensive. Yet by 1939, that hard-won wisdom had evaporated into a vacuum of knowledge. The Royal Air Force had become a forgotten relation. Its reconnaissance wings were clipped by institutional neglect. While the Nazi regime built a massive war machine, the British were flying into the teeth of the Luftwaffe in lumbering, obsolete aircraft. Inside the cockpit of a Blenheim over the Siegfried Line in late 1939, the air is a freezing cocktail of oil fumes and raw fear. The pilot can feel the airframes shuddering. A 90-mile-per-hour speed disadvantage makes him a sitting duck for the sleek Messerschmitts rising from the clouds below. There are no high-tech cameras here. Often, it is just a soldier leaning out of a hatch with a handheld glass plate camera. His fingers go numb in the freezing slipstream. The loss rates are harrowing. 16 aircraft vanish in just 89 missions. It is a suicide run fueled by guesswork. It is a desperate attempt to see over the hill, with equipment that belongs in a museum. The military hierarchy remains stagnant, dismissing the eyes in the air as a secondary chore. The system is breaking. To survive, the British must look toward the shadows of the civilian world. The salvation of British intelligence did not come from a general. It came from a flamboyant Australian entrepreneur with a penchant for fur-lined suits and a total disregard for the King's regulations. Sidney Cotton operated out of a quiet office in St. James's Square. He was fueled by an obsession with technical perfection and a profound frustration with military incompetence. He did not see reconnaissance as a chore. He saw it as a pursuit for the gentleman scientist. In the spring of 1939, the Air Ministry was backed into a corner by its own failure. They signed the Newall-Cotton Agreement. It was a desperate secret pact that gave this maverick carte blanche to operate outside the stifling military structure. Cotton's unit was a band of misfits who wore civilian clothes and refused to salute. They treated their aircraft like high-performance jewelry. They stripped the guns from Spitfires. They polished the airframes until they shone like mirrors to squeeze out every extra mile of speed. They fitted them with extra fuel tanks. They were transforming spying into a rigorous, cold science. The transition was best captured in the Tempelhof joyride. Cotton flew a high-ranking Nazi official over the Siegfried Line under the guise of a friendly civilian flight. He had a secret camera hidden in his wing. As the Nazi pointed out the sights, the hidden lenses clicked away. He captured the very fortifications the Royal Air Force had died trying to see. This was the birth of the spies in the sky. It was a shift from the bravado of the fighter pilot to the solitary, high-altitude monk. The most potent weapon was no longer a machine gun. The new weapon was a 36-inch lens and the icy, analytical mind of the interpreter. In the oil-stained shadows of a hangar at Heston, the air smells of high-octane fuel and cellulose dope. Sidney Cotton stands over a Spitfire, acting as a surgeon preparing for a radical amputation. To the military hierarchy, the Spitfire was a sacred icon of firepower. It bristled with 8303 caliber machine guns. To Cotton, those guns were nothing but 400 pounds of dead weight. They dragged the aircraft down into the reach of German flak. He watches as his mechanics begin the sacrilege. These men ignore the crisp uniforms of the service for grease-stained sweaters. They wrench the guns from the wings. They leave gaping muzzles that they quickly cover with smooth, aerodynamic skin. They tear out the heavy radio sets and the cockpit heater. They strip the machine down to its skeletal essence. Every ounce of weight saved is an extra foot of altitude. Every ounce is a few more knots of speed. To fill the void left by the ammunition boxes, they install extra fuel tanks. They transform the short-range interceptor into a flying petrol tank. Finally, they cut a hole in the belly and mount a 5-inch lens. This is Cotton's Blue Spitfire. It is polished with beeswax until the surface is as slick as glass. It is designed to disappear into the deep, dark azure of the stratosphere. It flies where the air is too thin for a Messerschmitt to breathe. While Cotton's Mavericks redefined the machine, a different kind of revolution was taking root 30 miles away. The grand mansion of Medmenham sits perched above the Thames. Its manicured gardens and sweet-smelling wisteria mask the cold machinery of the Central Interpretation Unit. Here, the rigid military hierarchy is quietly dismantled by an influx of academics. They recruit archaeologists like Glyn Daniel, along with geologists and artists. These people are trained to look at a landscape and find anomalies. An archaeologist who spent a lifetime identifying Roman villas in a wheat field is the perfect candidate to spot a camouflaged bunker. They treat the intelligence as a jigsaw with only a few pieces. They work in 12-hour shifts under the hum of desk lamps. The air in the workshop is thick with the smell of sawdust and polystyrene. Sculptors and silversmiths begin turning flat photographs into three-dimensional tactical reality. This is the Medmenham paradigm. It is the realization that a photograph is useless without a mind capable of decoding the secrets hidden in the shadows. The first true test of this battle for truth arrived with the freezing winds of March 19, 1940. The Air Ministry was desperate for a victory to feed a public hungry for action. They believed they had found it in a raid on the German seaplane base at Sylt. As the bombers returned through the dawn mist, the pilots' reports were electrifying. They spoke of terrific success. They described massive explosions and hangars engulfed in flames. The newspapers trumpeted the triumph to the world. But when the reconnaissance film from Cotton's high-altitude Spitfires reached the darkrooms at Medmenham, the spies in the sky saw a different war. Inside a cramped briefing room, the atmosphere turned glacial as the photo interpreters laid the wet negatives onto the light tables. There were no charred hangars. There were no craters in the runways. Instead, the film showed the spaghetti streaks of night photography flashes, white lines of light that revealed the bombs had fallen miles wide of the target, some even striking the neutral soil of Denmark. The accuracy gap was a yawning chasm between the heroic myth of the pilot and the cold, unyielding evidence of the lens. When the civil servant David Butt compiled these findings into what would become the devastating Butt Report, it sent a shockwave through the Air Ministry. The camera had done the unthinkable. It had held the military command accountable. The air marshals reacted with fury, some dismissing the reports as the work of defeatist boffins who did not understand the bravado of the cockpit. This created a permanent, simmering suspicion between the men who dropped the bombs and the men and women at Medmenham who proved where they actually landed. The eyes in the air had become more than just a strategic asset. They had become the ultimate arbiter of truth, ensuring that for the remainder of the war, the Allied command could no longer rely on the guesswork of the past, but would have to face the brutal, photographic reality of the present. But while the bombers struggled to find their targets over land, a new crisis was brewing at sea. By May 1941, the war had moved from the clouds over London to the grey, churning wastes of the North Atlantic. The British Empire was a besieged island, its lifeblood, the merchant convoys, strangled by a new terror. The Bismarck, at 820 feet long and bristling with 15-inch guns, the German battleship was not just a ship, it was a floating apocalypse. For days, the Admiralty had been blind, haunted by the nightmare of this monster breaking out into the open sea to butcher the Atlantic lifelines. The task of finding the ghost fell to a 21-year-old pilot named Michael B. Suckling. Inside the cockpit of his unarmed Spitfire, Suckling was suspended in a world of agonizing contradictions. At 30,000 feet, the sky was a deep, dark azure, beautiful and lethal. The temperature outside was 60 degrees below zero, and even with his thick white sweater and silk glove liners, the cold bit through to the bone. He sat in a state of stratosphere solitude. His only company, the rhythmic hiss of his oxygen mask, and the vibration of a Merlin engine burning a gallon of fuel every 60 seconds. He was rubbernecking constantly, twisting his neck until it chafed against his collar, scanning for the giant pointer of a condensation trail that would signal a German interceptor. To be seen was to die. He crossed the Norwegian coast, the jagged, snow-dusted fjords looking like white veins against the dark granite. Then, in Grimstad Fjord, he saw it. Even from 6 miles up, the Bismarck was unmistakable, a massive slate-grey sliver moored near the shore, surrounded by a ring of tiny, protective destroyers. Suckling did not feel a surge of heroics. He felt the cold, clinical pressure of the mission. He banked the Spitfire, the G-force pressing him into his seat, and aligned his belly-mounted cameras. He did not fire a gun, he fired a shutter. The metallic thud click of the camera was the only shot fired in the encounter. The flight back was a desperate, fuel-starved dash. Suckling watched his gauges with a hawk's intensity, nursing the throttle as the English coast finally materialized through the haze. He touched down at the airfield, his legs cramping as he climbed out of the cramped cockpit. He did not wait for a debrief. A blue transport car was already idling on the tarmac. The raw film was snatched from the aircraft and rushed to Medmenham, where the backroom analysts were waiting in a fever of anticipation. When the prints were pulled from the chemical baths, still dripping and smelling of acid, the spies in the sky confirmed the nightmare. The Bismarck was fueling. The hunt was on. Suckling's solitary flight had stripped the invisibility from the German Navy, turning a blind naval search into a targeted execution. While the Bismarck dominated the headlines, a more existential drama was unfolding across the English Channel. Throughout the summer of 1940, the British public lived in a state of visceral dread. Churchill's speeches spoke of an impending armada and a struggle for survival, and the civilian population looked at the horizon, waiting for the first wave of Nazi landing craft to hit the beaches. But inside the broken-down-looking suburban factory of Paduak House, the photo interpreters were seeing a different war. The analysts, including archaeologists and geologists who treated the French coast like a laboratory, were engaged in a needle-in-a-haystack count of every vessel from the Scheldt to the Seine. They used the Swiss Wild A5 stereo plotter, a massive gleaming machine that allowed them to see the world in 3 dimensions. As they peered through the lenses, the flat grey images of the Rhine barges popped into 3D. The tension in the room was suffocating. Michael Spender, an interpreter of legendary intensity, labored through a 36-hour shift without sleep, his eyes bloodshot from the strain of the stereoscope. He was looking at the 1,700 barges Churchill had mentioned to the House of Commons. To the untrained eye, it looked like an invasion fleet. To the Medmenham boffins, it looked like a bluff. They scrutinized the vessels with surgical precision, measuring shadows to determine their depth in the water and searching for the telltale signs of military conversion. The breakthrough was a moment of cold mathematical clarity. Out of the thousands of vessels, the analysts could only confirm 6, just 6, that had been fitted with landing ramps. The rest were puny, ill-equipped riverboats, utterly incapable of surviving the swell of the channel or carrying the heavy armor needed for an assault. Spender famously threw down his optical viewer in a fit of visceral relief and dread, realizing that Hitler was playing a high-stakes game of psychological warfare. On September 18, 1940, the cameras captured the final proof. The invasion fleet was dispersing, the barges retreating back into the safety of the inland canals. The eyes in the air had called the Führer's bluff. While the world waited for a massacre, the photo interpreters at Medmenham quietly informed the War Cabinet that the threat of invasion had evaporated. It was proof that in the modern era, the most potent weapon was not the gun, but the cold, analytical lens that saw through the fog of war. The morning of August 19, 1942, was defined by a sound that would haunt Allied planners for the rest of the war. It was the frantic, metallic screech of Churchill tanks churning uselessly against the flint stones of Dieppe. On the shoreline of Blue Beach, the air was a choking fog of salt spray and cordite. One tank, named Calgary, attempted to lurch forward, but its tracks found no purchase on the smooth, rounded stones. This shingle acted like ball bearings under 30 tons of steel. To the men inside those hulls, the beach was a death trap they had never been warned about. From the towering white cliffs above, German gunners looked down with clinical precision. They raked the stalled landing craft with crossfire from concealed positions. There were no secrets here for the defenders. They held the high ground, and the Allies were blind. The disaster was total, leaving over 3,300 men killed wounded, or captured in a single morning. As the survivors pulled away from the burning steel and the bodies of the Canadian infantry, a grim realization settled over the high command. They had tried to seize a port by brute force without knowing the height of a seawall or the composition of the sand. Dieppe became the bloody learning curve, a catastrophic proof that seizing a port was a fantasy. If they were ever to return to the continent, they could not just guess. They had to own the ground before they ever touched it. This failure transformed Medmenham from a specialized retreat into a sprawling industrial intelligence factory. The splendid madhouse of the early war years evaporated, replaced by a relentless 24-hour assembly line of data. By 1943, the Siegfried Line was no longer a wall of concrete, but a mountain of paper. 1 million photographic prints were arriving at the mansion every single month. The British scientists were now joined by a surge of American energy as the United States 8th Air Force moved in. They brought a culture of industrial dominance to the quiet halls of Danesfield House. The rooms echoed with the clatter of teleprinters and the frantic shuffling of railway analysts. These specialists lived in a state of exhaustion, their eyes tracing the silver veins of the French rail network. They were executing the transport plan, a cold mathematical strategy to paralyze the Nazi war machine by systematically shattering every bridge, every turntable, and every marshalling yard in northern France. They aimed to freeze the enemy in place. Deep in the basement of the mansion, the air smelled of damp clay sawdust and the sharp tang of balsa wood glue. This was the model section, the inner sanctum where the spies in the sky translated two-dimensional shadows into physical reality. Artists and silversmiths hunched over massive tables, their hands stained with ink and plaster. They were building the blueprints of victory, creating hyper-detailed three-dimensional relief models of the Normandy coastline. Using specialized magnifying measures, an interpreter would call out the height of a German bunker or the depth of a trench. The model makers would then recreate it to scale using matchsticks and polystyrene. In one corner of the room, a sculptor worked on a section of Omaha Beach. He was not just molding sand, he was placing hedgehogs, the lethal, six-armed steel obstacles designed to gut the bellies of Allied landing craft. The team had discovered them through a stroke of photographic luck. A stray bomb had detonated near the tide line, and the resulting shadow in the reconnaissance film revealed the underwater mines. Nearby, another analyst used a stereoscope to identify Rommel's asparagus. These were thousands of iron rods and wooden stakes driven into the fields to impale Allied paratroopers and gliders. Every detail captured on film was a life saved on the ground. The model makers worked with a feverish patience, knowing that a 3-inch error in their clay could mean a tank foundering in a hidden peat bog. They knew a single mistake could mean a platoon being mowed down by a pillbox they had failed to model. The work was a bridge between the abstract and the visceral. When General Montgomery or Omar Bradley walked into the room, they did not look at maps. They walked onto the models. They stood over the balsa wood hedgerows of the bocage, those ancient 12-foot-high mud and shrub walls that would soon turn the French countryside into a labyrinth of slaughter. They studied the white dots in the turned-over soil that signaled newly laid minefields. By the spring of 1944, the Allies had stripped the Atlantic Wall of its mystery. The intelligence units had turned German logistics into a shattered jigsaw puzzle. They ensured that when the hammer finally fell, the Nazi defenders would be starved of reinforcements. The eyes in the air had done what the tanks at Dieppe could not. They had mapped the path through the fire, turning the most formidable fortress in history into a precisely understood objective. The war was no longer a gamble of bravado. It was a calculated conclusion, written in the sawdust and shadows of Medmenham. Now, we return to that dimly lit room where the silence was broken by the sharp, rhythmic clicking of a telephone dial. Constance Babington Smith's discovery of the midge, that tiny cruciform speck on the Peenemünde ramp, had ignited a firestorm. Within hours, those grainy prints were the primary exhibits in a high-stakes trial of scientific intuition. In the subterranean shadows of the Cabinet Office, R.V. Jones stood before a U-shaped table with the photographic proof in his hand. Across from him, the bureaucratic skeptics had insisted that such a weapon was a physical impossibility. They called it a phantom born of an overactive imagination. Jones did not argue with theory. He simply slid the photographs across the table. Under the harsh electric lights, the ski-shaped launch sites of northern France silenced the room. They were all precisely aligned like arrows, pointing at the heart of London. The scientific schism was over. The order for Operation Crossbow was issued with frantic urgency. The Allies unleashed a deluge of 1,900 tons of ordnance onto the Baltic coast and the hidden forest sites. This surgical intervention, born of a single woman's intuition, delayed the flying bomb campaign by critical months. Had those robotic bombs fallen during the spring of 1944, the massive assembly of men in southern England would have been a slaughterhouse. Instead, the eyes in the air had bought the Allies the time they needed to launch the liberation of Europe. By the summer of 1944, the Medmenham machine had reached a state of terrifying clinical perfection. The analysts had become so adept at reading the photographic skin of the enemy that they could predict industrial output by counting shadows. But this supreme efficiency carried a hidden, darker price. The briefing had become a set of intellectual blinders. An interpreter was trained to find exactly what they were told to look for. They looked for ball bearings, synthetic rubber, and radar bowls. Everything else was ignored as background noise. This institutional blindness reached a haunting peak on August 23, 1944. A reconnaissance Mosquito, flying at 30,000 feet, banked over the massive industrial complex of Monowitz in occupied Poland. The air was clear, the sun high, and the resulting film was a masterpiece of high-altitude clarity. Back at Medmenham, the analyst hunched over the light table, their nose inches from the wet negatives. They were looking for the IG Farben synthetic oil plants, meticulously marking the progress of the factory's reconstruction after a previous raid. They measured the height of the chimneys and the volume of coal in the stockyards with surgical precision. Yet, just a few inches away on that same strip of film, captured in the same brilliant sunlit detail, lay the Auschwitz-Birkenau complex. The camera, which never lied, had recorded it all. The lens captured the rows of barracks, the high-voltage fences, the gate of death, and the dark, snaking lines of human beings being led toward the crematoria. In one frame, a plume of smoke could be seen rising from a chimney, a smudge against the grey landscape of the camp. But because the analyst had not been briefed to look for genocide, the evidence was treated as irrelevant, because their mission parameters were strictly limited to the transport plan and industrial targets. The images were filed away in silence. The industrial mechanics of the Holocaust were captured with the same cold analytical lens as a railway turntable. The spies in the sky had stripped away the shroud of the Nazi war machine, illuminating its factories and its fortresses with godlike omniscience. Yet they remained tragically blind to the human apocalypse, unfolding in the shadows of the very targets they were mapping. The photographs sat in the archives for months, a silent, unblinking testament to a chilling reality. While the camera could see everything, the human mind could only process what it was prepared to face. The sky over Munich on July 25, 1944, was a vast, indifferent expanse of pale blue. But for Flight Lieutenant A.E. Wall and his navigator, the air inside their de Havilland Mosquito had suddenly turned electric with the scent of ozone and cold sweat. For years, the plywood wonder had been the untouchable ghost of the stratosphere. Its twin Merlin engines could outrun anything the Luftwaffe could throw at it. But as Wall banked the aircraft, a silver shape tore through the clouds below with a sound unlike any piston engine in history. It was a high-pitched, predatory shriek that signaled the end of Allied air invincibility. This was the Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter. Wall watched in the rearview mirror as the German Stormbird closed the gap with terrifying ease, its nose-mounted cannons flickering. The Mosquito, stripped of guns for the sake of its cameras, was suddenly a relic. Wall slammed the throttles forward, the G-force pinning him into his seat, as he executed a violent, shuddering turn. The navigator's head snapped down to his knees as the aircraft groaned under the stress. The wind whistled through the cockpit seals like a sharpened blade. For 20 agonizing minutes, the crew played a high-speed game of cat and mouse. Their survival depended on the frantic juddering of a vertical stall to evade a machine that was 50 miles per hour faster than they were. When Wall finally dove into a thick bank of cumulus, his heart hammered against his ribs with a sickening rhythm. The lonely business of the reconnaissance pilot had just entered a new lethal era. The age of the solitary observer was being hunted into extinction by the age of the supersonic interceptor. This terrifying encounter over Munich forced a radical evolution that would outlive the war itself. The Medmenham method, that painstaking intellectual graft of reading shadows, had to be married to a new doctrine of extreme speed and altitude. As the Iron Curtain descended across Europe, the spies in the sky didn't vanish. They simply climbed higher. The drafty, wisteria-scented halls of Danesfield House gave way to the pressurized clinical silence of the Cold War. By the 1960s, the unblinking eye had transitioned from the belly of a Spitfire to the sleek black fuselage of the SR-71 Blackbird. Pilots flew at 80,000 feet, where the sky turns the color of a bruise, and the friction of the air heats the titanium skin to 600 degrees Fahrenheit. The mission had changed from catching film magazines in an English field to catching film capsules falling from orbit. During the Corona satellite program, aircraft-mounted nets were used to snatch intelligence from the air over the Pacific. The 1995 declassification of over 800,000 Corona images brought this overhead gaze to light. It revealed that the paper records at Medmenham had grown into a digital ocean of surveillance. The world was now being watched in every corner, 24 hours a day. By the 21st century, the distance between the lens and the trigger had collapsed entirely. In a 2005 Joint Operations Center in Iraq, the air was chilled by industrial air conditioning and hummed with the electric drone of servers. This was the Death Star, where intelligence officers and lawyers sat before three massive plasma screens. The grainy, thermal infrared feed from a Predator drone, thousands of feet above Fallujah, replaced the stereoscope of Constance Babington Smith. There was no third-phase delay here, and no waiting for the film to dry in a chemical bath. A commander could reach out with a finger, touch a flickering heat signature on the screen, and authorize a strike in real time. The gentleman scientist rigor of the Medmenham boffins had been refined into a clinical, detached feedback loop. The photographic skin of the enemy was now peeled back with a laser-guided finality. Yet for all the digital wizardry of the modern era, the frozen record of the aerial photograph remained the final, unyielding arbiter of human history. This was never more evident than on a quiet afternoon in 2001. A historian sat down with Major Dick Winters, the legendary commander of Band of Brothers fame. For over 50 years, Winters had carried a vivid, heroic memory of the assault on Bricourt Manor during D-Day. He remembered the German guns positioned in a specific tree line. He remembered the exact path his men took through the tall grass of the French countryside. But as the historian unfurled a poster-sized aerial photograph taken by a reconnaissance Spitfire on the morning of June 6, 1944, the room fell into a heavy silence. Winters leaned over the image, his weathered hands tracing the grainy landscape. There, captured in the cold, objective light of a 50-year-old negative, was the truth. The guns weren't where he remembered. The hedgerows were different. The objective lens, unaffected by the adrenaline of combat or the fog of 70 years of memory, gently corrected the veteran's story. Winters looked at the photo for a long time, the unblinking eye staring back at him from across the decades. He didn't argue, he simply nodded. The spies in the sky had recorded the war exactly as it was, not as the men who fought it wished it to be. While the heroes faded and the monuments crumbled, the millions of photographs filed away in the archives remained. They are a silent, black and white testament to the reality of the past. In the theater of war, the camera was the only witness that never forgot, never lied, and never blinked. If you value these historical accounts, please subscribe to the channel and like this video. It helps us preserve these stories, and please share your own memories or thoughts in the comments below.